By the fire's glow, the truth is always revealed. Welcome to the Fireside Casebook.
The rain in Lochdubh did not merely fall, it conducted a sustained, spiteful assault on the landscape. It drove horizontally in grey sheets, whipping across the surface of the sea loch and turning the single street of the village into a slick, peaty soup. Inside the police station, which was also his home, Police Constable Hamish Macbeth was engaged in high-level strategic contemplation. He was contemplating the kettle, he was contemplating his stove, and most importantly, he was contemplating how long he could ignore the ringing telephone before headquarters in Strathbane sent a squad car to check if he had died of boredom. Hamish was a tall, gangling man with flaming red hair and eyes that often held a deceptive look of bovine vacuity. It was a look he cultivated with the dedication other men applied to competitive rose growing. It saved him an enormous amount of paperwork. The phone continued its shrill demand. Hamish sighed, a sound that seemed to originate from the very soles of his large police boots. Next to the glowing Rayburn stove, his dog, Towser, a mongrel of indeterminate lineage and permanent indolence, thumped his tail once in sympathy and went back to sleep. "Ah, well," Hamish muttered. He picked up the receiver just as the ringing stopped. He held it to his ear for a moment, listening to the dial tone, then replaced it with a satisfied nod. "Technical difficulties," he told Towser, a terrible scourge in the Highlands. The immediate danger past, Hamish's thoughts returned to their natural gravitational centre, his stomach. The larder was depressingly bare, containing only a heel of stale loaf and a tin of sardines that he suspected might be older than the Act of Union. His own cooking was edible only in emergencies. It was time to go on patrol. Patrol, in Hamish's lexicon, usually meant a slow amble to the Tommel Castle Hotel to see if Mr. Johnson, the manager, was feeling charitable with coffee and scones, followed by a drift down to the harbour to listen to the fishermen complain about the EU quotas. He shrugged on his heavy police greatcoat, jammed his peaked cap onto his fiery thatch, and stepped out into the deluge. The wind immediately tried to rip the door off its hinges. Lochdubh was usually a peaceful place, its silence broken only by the bleating of sheep and the rustle of lace curtains as neighbours spied on one another. But lately the atmosphere had curdled. The source of the sourness was, inevitably, a newcomer, a Sassenach. Mrs. Agatha Pemberton was a wealthy widow from the softer southern counties of England, possessing a voice like a brass foghorn and a sense of entitlement that could crush granite. She had purchased Craigie House, a charming, slightly dilapidated Georgian manse perched on a rise overlooking the village near the old stone packhorse bridge that spanned the rushing River Dubh. Hamish shivered, and not just from the damp seeping into his bones. He had met Mrs. Pemberton twice. The first time, she had demanded he arrest the postman for looking at her suspiciously. The second time, she had instructed him to shoot a seagull that was fouling her newly laid patio. On both occasions, Hamish had deployed his best vacant stare, mumbled something about complex jurisdictions, and retreated. As he squelched along the waterfront road, head down against the wind, he heard the unmistakable boom of the widow's voice cutting through the storm. "Unacceptable! Do you hear me, you ridiculous little man? Utterly unacceptable!" Hamish slowed his pace. He wasn't shirking duty, he was merely gathering intelligence. He peered through the rain towards the humpbacked bridge. Two figures stood near the riverbank. One was unmistakably Mrs. Pemberton. Even in the gloom, her yellow oilskin jacket was aggressively bright, a screaming neon challenge to the muted Highland palate. She was gesticulating wildly with a silver-tipped walking stick. The target of her wrath appeared to be old Archie MacLean, the village handyman and occasional poacher. Archie was shrinking into his own coat, looking like a tortoise trying to retract its head entirely. Hamish drifted closer, adopting the slouch of a man with nowhere to be and all day to get there. "Told you specifically," Mrs. Pemberton was bellowing, "that I wanted that eyesore of a hawthorn hedge ripped out today. I am paying for a view of the loch, Mr. McLean, not a view of some scruffy bushes." "It's the birds, you see, mistress." Archie's voice was a reedy pipe against the wind. "It's nesting season. Bad luck to tear down a hawthorn in bloom. The fairies dinna like it." Mrs. Pemberton let out a barking laugh that startled a nearby sheep. "Fairies, I've never heard such superstitious claptrap in my life. You are lazy, Mr. McLean. Like everyone else in this god-forsaken backwater, if that hedge isn't gone by tomorrow, I shall hire someone from Strathbane who knows how to follow an order." She turned sharply and saw Hamish standing there, water streaming off his cap like a miniature waterfall. "You there, constable," she shouted. "Don't just stand there looking like a drowned rat. Do something useful. Tell this peasant to do his job." Hamish touched the brim of his cap slowly. He let his jaw drop slightly. "Tell him, ma'am?" "Tell him what, exactly?" Mrs. Pemberton bristled with fury. "To remove the hedge. He's refusing to work." "Ah," Hamish said, drawing the syllable out until it nearly snapped. "Well now, Archie is self-employed, you see. It's a civil matter. Very tricky things, civil matters. Lots of forms." He sniffed loudly. "Terrible weather for forms. The ink runs." The widow stared at him, her face turning a shade of magenta that rivaled the heather. "You are useless," she hissed. "Utterly useless. I don't know why I pay taxes." She spun on her heel, her walking stick thwacking against the wet stones of the bridge, and marched up the driveway toward Craigie House. Hamish watched her go. The wind howled around the ancient stone bridge, a sound that suddenly felt colder than before. Archie McLean spat on the ground in the direction of her retreating yellow back. "She'll bring trouble down on herself, that one," Archie muttered, wiping rain from his wrinkled face. "Tearing up the old ways. Money canna buy off the bad luck, Hamish." "Aye, Archie," Hamish said softly, his eyes sharp now that the widow couldn't see them. "But it can certainly buy a grand amount of resentment." His stomach rumbled fiercely. The brief burst of social friction had burned off his reserves. He left Archie by the condemned hedge and continued his trudge toward the hotel, dreaming of hot coffee and the quiet life, unaware that the quiet life was about to leave Lochdubh for a very long time. The following morning, the rain had downgraded itself from a biblical deluge to a persistent Highland seep. A thick, clotted mist, the kind the locals called har, clung to the peaks of the Quillins and smothered the village of Lochdubh in a damp, grey blanket. Hamish Macbeth was currently in the kitchens of the Tommel Castle Hotel, a location he frequented with the stealth of a marauding fox. He had managed to convince Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife and a woman of formidable social standing, that he was undernourished due to the rigours of his lonely watch over the village. Consequently, he was now sitting before a plate of thick-cut bacon, 2 shimmering fried eggs, and a mountain of buttery toast. "It's a hard life you lead, Hamish," Mrs. Wellington remarked, her eyes twinkling with a mix of maternal pity and shrewd scepticism. "Aye, it is that, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish replied through a mouthful of toast. "The criminal element never sleeps, you see. I must maintain my strength for the chase." The chase at that moment involved pursuing a stray piece of yolk with a crust of bread. He was just about to achieve success when the heavy oak door of the kitchen swung open with a violence that made Towser, snoozing under the table, let out a startled yelp. Archie McLean burst in. His face, usually the colour of a cured ham, was a sickly curdled white. He was trembling so violently that his wet tweed jacket seemed to be vibrating. "Hamish! Hamish, man, you must come quick!" Archie gasped, clutching the doorframe. "It's the widow, the Sassenach woman, up at the bridge." Hamish felt a cold lump of lead settle in his stomach, and it wasn't the bacon. He looked down at his plate, nearly finished but not quite, and sighed. "Is she shouting again, Archie? Because if it's just more talk about the hedge, I have a very important investigation into this egg to complete." "She's no shouting," Archie whispered, his voice cracking. "She'll never shout again. She's stuck, Hamish, in the river. And she's looking at me, only she's no seeing me." Hamish stood up slowly. The lazy, slouching posture remained, but his hazel eyes had lost their vacant glaze. He grabbed his coat, whistled for Towser, and followed Archie out into the suffocating mist. The walk to the River Dubh was conducted in a grim silence, broken only by the squelch of boots and the distant, mournful lowing of a cow. As they approached the old stone bridge, the sound of the rushing water grew to a roar. The river was high, swollen by the previous night's rain, a churning tea-coloured torrent. "There," Archie pointed, his hand shaking. Hamish looked. At first he saw only the bright offensive yellow of the widow's oilskin jacket. It was snagged on a jagged outcrop of rock and a tangle of fallen timber right beneath the central arch of the bridge. Agatha Pemberton was positioned in a way that was both tragic and absurdly humiliating. She was face down in the shallow, racing water, but her lower half was hiked up onto a submerged log, her expensive tweed skirt pushed up to her waist, revealing a pair of sensible, sturdy British bloomers and bright purple support hose. Her silver-tipped walking stick was wedged firmly into a crack in the bridge's masonry, dangling above her like an abandoned fishing rod. "Lord preserve us," Hamish muttered. He scrambled down the slippery embankment, his long legs moving with a sudden lithe grace that would have surprised anyone who saw him mooching in the village. He reached the body and placed 2 fingers against the side of the widow's neck, though he already knew it was a formality. The skin was ice cold, and the flesh had the unmistakable doughy feel of the recently departed. He didn't move her. He stood there, ankle deep in the freezing river dew, observing. He noted the way the yellow oilskin was torn at the shoulder. He noted the position of the walking stick, too high for her to have dropped it while falling. He noticed a small, dark bruise just behind her ear, barely visible beneath her sodden, permed hair. It was a neat, circular mark, not the kind of jagged injury one would expect from a tumble onto river rocks. Behind him, on the bank, Towser began to howl, a long, thin sound that echoed off the damp stones of the bridge. Is she gone?" Archie called out from the safety of the path. "She is that," Hamish replied, his voice flat. He looked up at the bridge, then at the condemned hedge a few yards away, and finally at the imposing silhouette of Craigie House looming through the Har. He felt a deep, weary annoyance. A murder meant Strathbane. It meant detectives in shiny cars. It meant Chief Inspector Blair shouting and spitting on his clean floor. Most importantly, it meant he wouldn't be able to finish his breakfast, or likely have a peaceful meal for a week. "Archie," Hamish called out, wading back to the bank while shaking the water from his boots. "Go to the hotel. Tell Mr. Johnson to phone the station in Strathbane. Tell them we have a suspicious death at the Lochdubh bridge." He looked back at the widow, in her yellow coat, looking for all the world like a discarded piece of plastic caught in the weeds. "And Archie?" "Aye, Hamish. Tell them to tell Blair to take his time. The mist is terrible for driving, and I'm sure he wouldn't want to have an accident." Hamish knew Blair would do the exact opposite, but as he stood there, watching the grey water swirl around the dead woman, he began to wonder who in the quiet, gossipy village of Lochdubh had finally decided that Mrs. Agatha Pemberton had shouted her last command. The peace of Lochdubh didn't just break, it was shattered by the rhythmic, discordant wail of a police siren that echoed off the surrounding hills like the cry of a banshee with a megaphone. 2 white and blue patrol cars from Strathbane screeched around the corner of the harbour, tyres spitting gravel and peat-stained water, before sliding to a halt near the old stone bridge. From the lead car emerged Detective Chief Inspector Blair. If Hamish Macbeth was a long, cool drink of Highland water, Blair was a double shot of cheap, burning rotgut. He was a portly man whose belt seemed to be engaged in a losing battle with his stomach, and his face was the colour of a slapped thigh, a permanent mottled crimson that deepened whenever he saw Hamish. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice carrying over the roar of the River Dhu. He didn't walk, he charged, his shiny black shoes instantly ruined by the mud. "I might have known. A body drops in the water and you're standing there looking like you're waiting for a bus." Hamish, who was currently leaning against a damp stone wall and sharing a bit of dried fish with Towser, touched his cap. "Good morning to you, Inspector." "It's a grand day for the ducks, is it no?" Blair reached him, smelling of stale cigarettes and an aggressive amount of peppermint meant to hide a lunchtime whiskey. He looked down at Hamish's muddy boots and then at the dog. "Get that flea-bitten rug away from the crime scene. And look at you, you're a disgrace to the uniform. Is that a salmon scale on your sleeve?" "I couldn't say, sir," Hamish said with a look of wide-eyed innocence. "I was helping a local lad with his nets earlier. Community policing, you see." Blair let out a sound like a punctured tyre. "Community policing? You're a lazy peasant in a peaked cap. Now where is she?" Hamish pointed a long, bony finger toward the central arch of the bridge. The yellow oilskin jacket was still visible, though the rising river was beginning to lap more aggressively at the widow's permed hair. Blair peered over the edge. Right. Accidental drowning. Case closed. She tripped, fell, and the current did the rest. Probably drunk on sherry, these old biddies. Get the divers to haul her out and let's get back to civilization. I've got a golf game at 4. "I wouldn't be so sure about the accident, sir," Hamish said softly. Blair spun around, his eyes narrowing. "Oh? And what does the great detective of the glens think? Did the fairies push her? Or maybe a vengeful haggis?" Hamish ignored the sarcasm. "The walking stick, sir. It's wedged in the masonry of the bridge, high up. If she'd tripped and fallen over the side, the stick would have gone into the water with her or stayed on the path. It looks placed. And there's a mark on the back of her head, a very neat round mark." Blair stomped toward the bridge, nearly slipping on a patch of moss. He squinted at the silver-tipped stick. "Rubbish. She probably waved it in the air as she went over. As for the mark, she hit a rock, didn't she? Rocks are round, Macbeth. Even you should know that." He turned his gaze toward the small crowd of villagers who had gathered at a respectful and eavesdropping distance. His eyes landed on Archie MacLean, who was still trembling and looking guiltier than a fox in a henhouse. "Who's that?" Blair barked. "That's Archie MacLean, sir," Hamish said. "He's the one who found her. He's the local handyman." Blair's face lit up with a predatory gleam. He loved an easy arrest. It meant less time in the stinking Highlands and more time at the pub in Strathbane. He marched over to Archie, who looked ready to bolt. "You, MacLean," Blair shouted, looming over the smaller man. "I heard you were arguing with the deceased yesterday. Something about a hedge? Something about bad luck and fairies?" Archie's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. I was just telling the mistress that the hawthorn, save it for the station," Blair interrupted, his voice booming. "You didn't like her, did you? She was a Sassenach coming in here and telling you what to do. So you gave her a nudge, didn't you? A little push off the bridge to protect your precious bushes." "No, I never," Archie wailed. "Jimmy, MacNab." Blair signalled to his 2 detectives, who were busy trying to keep their own shoes clean. "Cuff him. Take him back to Strathbane. We'll have a confession out of him by tea time. He's a local, he's poor, and he's got a motive. That's good enough for me." Hamish watched as the bewildered Archie was led away toward the police cars. He knew Archie wouldn't hurt a fly, mostly because he was too lazy and too terrified of the law. "Inspector," Hamish said, stepping into Blair's path. "Archie's a bit of a rogue with a salmon net, but he's no murderer. If you take him in now, you'll be missing the real thread. The widow had enemies with a lot more to lose than a hawthorn hedge." Blair shoved past him, nearly knocking Hamish's cap askew. "Listen to me, Macbeth. You stay out of my way. Keep your mouth shut and your nose out of police business. Go find a lost sheep or poach a trout. I'm the DCI, and I say we've got our man. If I hear you've been investigating, I'll have you transferred to a traffic beat in the centre of Glasgow so fast your head will spin." Blair climbed back into his car, slammed the door, and the convoy roared away, leaving a plume of blue exhaust to mingle with the Highland mist. Hamish stood alone on the bridge, the silence of the village slowly returning. He looked down at the river, then at the widow's house on the hill. "Well, Towser," Hamish sighed, adjusting his cap, "it looks like we're going to be very busy today, and we'll have to do it without the inspector finding out, which means we'll have to be even lazier than usual." He turned and began to saunter, not toward the station, but toward the post office. It was time for a cup of tea and a long, slow talk with Mrs. Emma Christie, the postmistress. If there was a secret in Lochdubh that she didn't know, it wasn't worth knowing. With the roar of Blair's engines fading into the distance, a heavy, expectant silence returned to Lochdubh. It was the kind of silence that usually preceded a storm, or in this case, a tidal wave of village gossip. Hamish Macbeth knew that while the official police were busy shouting at a terrified handyman in a concrete cell, the real story was being told over steaming kettles and behind the counters of the village shops. Hamish's first stop was the Lochdubh post office and general store. The windows were fogged with the breath of several elderly residents who were ostensibly checking the price of tinned peas, but were actually waiting for the latest update on the bridge murder. As Hamish entered, the bell above the door gave a cheerful ting that seemed wildly inappropriate for the occasion. Mrs. Emma Christie, the postmistress, a woman with a face like a dried apple and eyes that could spot a forged stamp at 50 paces, immediately ceased her conversation with the minister's wife. "Ach, Hamish," Mrs. Christie sighed, reaching automatically for the kettle. "A terrible business, and they've taken pure Archie. The man canna even kill a slug without apologising to its family." "It's the way of the world, Mrs. Christie," Hamish said, leaning his elbows on the counter and adopting a look of profound, weary stupidity. "The big men from the city like a quick answer. They dinna have the time for the truth." "And what is the truth, Hamish?" Mrs. Wellington asked, her eyes narrowing. "That's what I'm wondering," Hamish said, accepting a thick porcelain mug of tea and a fly cemetery, a heavy fruit-filled pastry. "It's a sad thing when a woman like Mrs. Pemberton comes to such a messy end. She was a woman of distinctive character." "Distinctive?" Mrs. Christie snorted. "She was a litigious nightmare, Hamish Macbeth, and you know it. Did you know she was trying to sue the village council to get the bridge closed to public traffic? Claimed the vibration was rattling her heirloom teacups." Hamish took a slow, contemplative bite of his pastry. "Is that so? And would the council have listened?" "They'd have had to. She had a lawyer from London who wrote letters on paper so thick you could use it for roofing, but that's not all." Mrs. Christie leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She was having rows with that companion of hers, the one who arrived last week, a Mrs. Hildred. Claims to be a niece, but she's got the eyes of a shark and a wardrobe that costs more than this whole shop." Hamish nodded vaguely. "A niece, you say? I didn't see anyone at the house when I went up." "That's because Mrs. Hildred has been suffering from a migraine since the body was found," Mrs. Wellington added with a sceptical sniff. "Though I saw her through the window of the hotel's dining room yesterday evening, eating a steak large enough to choke a Highland cow." Hamish tucked this information away. "And were there any other visitors? Strangers in cars, perhaps?" "Well," Mrs. Christie said, tapping her chin, "PK over at the curry shop mentioned a black car, a fancy one, very quiet, parked near the bridge path around 11 last night. He thought it was a tourist lost in the mist, but it didn't have the look of a rental." Hamish drained his tea and stood up, brushing crumbs from his greatcoat. "Well, I'm sure it was nothing. Probably just someone looking for the way to Ullapool. I'd best go and see if I can find a lost cat to justify my existence." He didn't find a cat. Instead, he drifted toward the Spice of the North, Lochdubh's solitary curry shop. P.K. Gupta was standing in the doorway, watching the mist with a look of profound longing for the sunshine of Delhi. Mr. Macbeth, PK greeted him. A dark day. The spirits are restless. The spirits and the police inspectors, PK, Hamish replied. Tell me about this black car. Mrs. Christie says you saw one. Nodded gravely. A Mercedes, Mr. Macbeth. Very dark blue, almost black. It sat by the bridge for 20 minutes. No lights. A person came from the direction of Craigie House. A woman, I think, but wrapped in a long cloak. They spoke, something was handed over, and the car drove away toward the Strathbane Road. Very fast, very reckless for the Ha. And the woman? Was it the widow? PK shook his head. Too small, too fast. Mrs. Pemberton moved like a battleship in a heavy sea. This one moved like a cat. Hamish thanked him and wandered back toward the harbour. His mooching had been productive. He now knew that the victim was a woman who was actively trying to destroy the village's infrastructure, had a mysterious niece with a predatory appetite, and was involved in midnight handoffs with expensive cars. DCI Blair was currently at the station in Strathbane, likely trying to bully Archie into admitting he used a fairy-enchanted hawthorn branch as a murder weapon. Meanwhile, the real killer was likely sitting in the warmth of Craigie House, thinking they had committed the perfect crime, because the only policeman left in the village was a lazy peasant who spent his time eating scones. Hamish looked up at the mountains, their peaks hidden in the grey shroud. They always forget, Towser, he murmured to the dog at his heels. That in the Highlands, the things you don't say are much louder than the things you do. He turned his steps toward the Tommel Castle Hotel. It was time to find Priscilla Halberton Smythe, if there was a social hierarchy to be navigated or an upper-class secret to be unearthed. Priscilla was the only one who could help him see past the fog. The Tommel Castle Hotel sat atop a rugged cliff, like a silent grey sentinel, its turrets occasionally peeking through the swirling Highland mist. It was a place of stiff linen, polished silver, and an atmosphere of such profound social superiority that even the sheep in the nearby fields seemed to bleat with an English accent. Hamish Macbeth paused at the grand entrance, wiping his muddy boots with a vigour that was more theatrical than effective. He felt the familiar, uncomfortable prickle of his own inadequacy. Usually he avoided the hotel unless he was mooching in the kitchens, but today he needed the front-of-house perspective. Specifically, he needed Priscilla Halberton Smythe. Priscilla, the daughter of the colonel who owned the estate, was a woman who existed in Hamish's heart like a beautiful, unattainable coastal light. Clear, bright, and far across a stretch of water he didn't know how to swim. She was elegant, educated, and possessed a cool poise that made Hamish feel every inch the useless peasant Blair accused him of being. He found her in the library, a room that smelled of old leather and expensive wood smoke. She was sitting by a crackling fire, a book in her lap, looking as though she had been painted into the scene by a particularly talented Renaissance artist. "Hamish," she said, looking up with a faint, amused smile, "I heard you had a body at the bridge. I assume that's why you're standing there looking like a startled horse." Hamish removed his cap, clutching it against his chest. "Aye, Priscilla, a bad business. Mrs. Pemberton." "A dreadful woman," Priscilla said, closing her book, "but a very rich one. My father is in a state. He was hoping she'd donate to the Roof Restoration Fund, but she was more interested in suing the village for existing in her line of sight." Hamish moved closer to the fire, the heat drawing the scent of damp wool from his coat. "The village gossip says she had a niece staying with her. A Mrs. Hildred." Priscilla's expression shifted, a subtle tightening at the corners of her eyes. "Why, yes, the niece. I met her at tea 2 days ago. She's about as much a niece to Agatha Pemberton as I am to the Loch Ness Monster." Hamish perked up. "Is that so? She's a professional companion, Hamish. There's a whole breed of them in the south. They find wealthy, lonely widows, move in and make themselves indispensable. My father called her a social parasite, which is high praise coming from him." Priscilla leaned forward, her voice dropping. "But there's something else. Mrs. Hildred isn't just a companion. I recognized her from a piece in The Lady a few years back. She was involved in a very messy probate scandal in Surrey. Another wealthy patron died under, let's say, convenient circumstances." Hamish frowned, his mind whirring behind his blank mask. "Blair thinks Archie MacLean did it because of a hedge." Priscilla let out a soft, melodic laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Then Blair is a fool. People like Agatha Pemberton don't get murdered over hedges, Hamish. They get murdered because they change their wills, or because they realise they've invited a viper into their parlour. Did she change it?" "She was planning to," Priscilla said. "She told me she was cutting off her lazy relatives and leaving everything to a cat sanctuary in Sussex. She was supposed to meet her solicitor in Strathbane this morning to sign the new papers." A key piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Hamish's mind. The midnight meeting PK had seen, the black Mercedes, the exchange of items. If the widow was about to sign away a fortune, someone would have been very desperate to stop her. "You look like you found a scent, Hamish," Priscilla remarked, watching him closely. "I might have," Hamish said, looking down at his boots. "But Blair has the only suspect he wants. He's no interested in vipers or probate scandals. He wants a quick win so he can go back to his golf." Priscilla stood up and walked toward him. For a moment, the air between them seemed to thin. She reached out and straightened his lopsided tie, her fingers grazing his collar. Hamish held his breath, his heart thumping against his ribs like a trapped bird. "You'll have to be clever then," she whispered. "Cleverer than Blair, and much faster than you usually like to be. Mrs. Hildred is already packing. She told the hotel manager she's leaving for London tonight because the Highland air is too distressing for her nerves." "Tonight?" Hamish's eyes sharpened. "The late train from Strathbane," Priscilla confirmed. "If you're going to sit and drink tea, Hamish, I suggest you do it very quickly." She stepped back, the moment of intimacy vanishing as quickly as the mist on a windy day. Hamish nodded, jammed his cap back onto his head, and turned to go. "Hamish," she called out as he reached the door. "Aye, do try not to get shot. It would be a terrible waste of a good policeman." Hamish stepped out into the cold air, his face flushed. He had a motive, he had a suspect, and he had the agonising knowledge that Priscilla Halberton Smythe was, as always, light years out of his reach. But more importantly, he knew he had a very short window of time before the niece disappeared into the fog of the south, taking the truth with her. The air in the Lochdubh police station was thick with the smell of wet wool, scorched coffee, and the toxic radiation of DCI Blair's ego. Blair was pacing the small office, his face a triumphant shade of sunset orange. On the scarred wooden desk lay a heavy mud-caked mallet, sealed in a plastic evidence bag. "Open and shut, Macbeth," Blair barked, slapping the desk so hard the tea in Hamish's mug jumped. "We found it in MacLean's garden shed, hidden under a pile of filthy old nets. There's hair on the head of it, grey hair, and the lab boys in Strathbane say the shape of the mallet matches the bruising on the back of the woman's skull perfectly." Hamish, who was sitting in the corner, appearing to be deeply fascinated by a loose thread on his sleeve, looked up slowly. "A mallet, sir. Archie uses that for fixing the fence posts. It's got a bit of a wobble in the handle. I don't care if it plays God Save the King," Blair roared. "It's a murder weapon. He hit her, dumped her in the river, and then hid the tool. He's a cold-blooded killer, that one. Probably wanted to stop her from cutting down his precious fairy bushes. It's a classic case of Highland superstition leading to homicide. It seems a bit, well, heavy for Archie," Hamish murmured. "He's got the arthritis in his wrists, you see. Swinging a mallet like that with enough force to kill a woman of Mrs. Pemberton's stature, it would have been a struggle for the pure man." "Are you questioning my professional judgment, Macbeth?" Blair stepped closer, his breath a potent mix of peppermint and aggression. "Because I've got a man in a cell, a motive, and a weapon. What have you got?" A dog that smells like a wet rug and a plate of half-eaten scones? I've got a question about the mud, sir, Hamish said, his voice mild and deferential. Blair blinked. The mud? Aye, the mud on the mallet. It's thick red clay. Now, as you'll know from your extensive experience, the soil around the bridge and Craigie House is pure peat, dark, black and acidic. There isn't a patch of red clay for 5 miles except— Hamish paused, letting the silence hang. Except for the construction site at the new visitor centre over by the Strathbane Road. Blair's face twitched. So? He went for a walk. He's a handyman. He works with mud. But Archie hasn't been over that way in weeks. He's been too busy dodging Mrs. Pemberton's demands. And there's the matter of the silver tip, sir. The what? The widow's walking stick, the one wedged in the bridge. I went back and had a look while you were in Strathbane. The silver tip is as bright as a new shilling. Now, if Mrs. Pemberton had walked from her house to that bridge in the middle of a Highland storm, that tip would be caked in black peat. But it's clean, perfectly clean, Blair snorted. She probably wiped it. Women like that are obsessed with cleanliness. In a hurricane, sir? Hamish asked innocently. With the river rising and the wind howling? It seems more likely to me that the stick never touched the ground. It was carried there, and the mallet— Well, if I were a clever person trying to frame a simple man, I'd take a tool from his shed, bash it against a rock to get some hair on it, and then put it back where the police would be sure to look. Blair's crimson face began to turn a worrying shade of purple. Listen to me, you carrot-topped moron. Archie McLean is staying in that cell. I'm calling a press conference for 5 o'clock. Swift justice in the Highlands. That's the headline. If you breathe a word of your clean silver theories to anyone, I'll have you guarding a turnip field in the Shetlands. Blair slammed out of the station, the door nearly rattling off its hinges. Hamish sat in the silence, the vacant look dropping from his face like a discarded mask. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, damp object he'd recovered from the riverbank, something Blair's experts had missed in their rush to find a culprit. It was a small, gold-plated pillbox. Inside were 3 tiny white tablets. Now why, Hamish whispered to Towser, would a woman who was supposedly in bed with a migraine have her prescription medication lying in the mud by the river? If she was in bed, her pills should be on her nightstand. He stood up, his movements sharp and purposeful. The mallet was a distraction, a clumsy red clay-covered distraction planted to satisfy a man like Blair, who only looked at the surface. The niece, Mrs. Hildred, had claimed she couldn't leave her room due to the pain, yet her medication was at the crime scene. And if the walking stick was clean, it meant the widow hadn't walked to her death. She had been delivered to it. "Come on, Towser," Hamish said, grabbing his cap. "We've got a niece to visit before she catches that train, and we'd best do it through the backwoods. We wouldn't want the inspector to think we were being anything other than useless." The evening air was thick with the scent of damp pine and the briny tang of the loch. As Hamish Macbeth skirted the edge of the woods behind Craigie House, he moved with a quiet efficiency that would have stunned the locals who only saw him as a permanent fixture of the village's laziness. To Hamish, the Highlands were a map of whispers and shadows, and right now, all shadows led to the back door of the widow's manse. He crouched behind a rhododendron bush, his eyes fixed on the kitchen window. Inside, Mrs. Hildred was no longer the frail, migraine-suffering relative. She moved with a sharp, frantic energy, pulling drawers open and rifling through papers on the mahogany sideboard. "Look at her, Towser," Hamish whispered. "Not a tear in sight, and her niece hardly cold in the water." Hamish knew that in the world of the wealthy, money was the sun around which all planets orbited, but money alone rarely led to a clumsy murder by a bridge. There was usually something more sour at the centre, a curdled bit of human vanity, or a secret that refused to stay buried. He remembered what Priscilla had said about the probate scandal in Surrey. If Mrs. Hildred was a professional companion, her reputation was her only currency. Agatha Pemberton, with her penchant for lawsuits and her sharp, invasive tongue, wouldn't have just invited a companion in. She would have dissected her life like a biologist with a particularly dull frog. Hamish slipped through the unlocked scullery door. The house felt cold, the heating likely turned down by the widow to save a few pence. He stood in the shadows of the hallway as Mrs. Hildred entered the drawing room, clutching a small leather-bound volume. "Looking for the new will, Mrs. Hildred?" Hamish asked, his voice a soft, low burr in the darkness. The woman let out a sharp, strangled gasp, spinning around. The book hit the floor with a heavy thud. In the dim light, her face was a mask of cold fury, the niece persona discarded like a moth-eaten coat. "You!" "The village idiot," she hissed, her London accent sharpening into something jagged. "What are you doing in here? This is private property. I'll have you sacked for trespassing." Hamish stepped into the light, his cap in his hand, looking every bit the apologetic local constable. "I'm sure you could, ma'am, but I was just worried about your health. I found your pillbox by the bridge, you see. I thought you might be needing your medicine." He held up the gold-plated box. Mrs. Hildred's eyes flickered to it, a momentary tremor in her hands. "I must have dropped it when I went to look for Agatha after she didn't return," she said quickly. Too quickly. "But you told the inspector you never left your bed," Hamish said, tilting his head with a look of confused innocence. "And then there's the matter of this book." He bent down, slowly, as if his back pained him, and picked up the volume she had dropped. It wasn't a will, it was a diary. Hamish flicked it open to the most recent entry. Agatha Pemberton's handwriting was like a row of barbed wire. "The Hildred woman is a fraud," Hamish read aloud, "a common thief from Surrey. I have the letters from the solicitor in Reigate. I shall not only strike her from my testament, but I shall ensure the authorities are informed of her services to the late Mr. Abernathy. She thinks she can leech off me, but she will find I have a very long memory for a slight." The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. "She wasn't just cutting you out of the money, was she?" Hamish said, his voice devoid of its usual Highland lilt. "She was going to destroy you. Agatha Pemberton didn't just want to win, she wanted to see people crawl. She was going to send those letters tonight, wasn't she, to the police in the south?" Mrs. Hildred drew herself up, her eyes like two chips of flint. The woman was a monster. She enjoyed making people suffer. She treated everyone, me, the villagers, that pathetic handyman, like dirt beneath her boots. She was going to ruin my life for a slight, a simple disagreement about a piece of jewellery. "So you decided to stop her," Hamish said. "You didn't use a mallet. You used that heavy silver-tipped walking stick of hers. A single sharp blow while she was looking at the river, thinking of how she'd ruined you. Then you wedged the stick in the bridge to make it look like a fall, and you went home to bed. You have no proof," she whispered, though her face had turned the colour of the Highland mist. "Oh, the inspector has his mallet," Hamish said, slipping back into his simple persona. "He's very happy with his mallet. But the red clay on it, that came from the visitor centre, and I think if I look in the trunk of that fancy Mercedes your friend drives, the one PK saw last night, I might find a pair of muddy boots and a certain set of letters that Agatha was planning to mail. The mention of the car broke her. The friend was her accomplice, likely a brother or a lover who handled the disposals in her line of work. "You're a fool, Macbeth," she spat. "Even if you're right, Blair will never believe you. He's already told the world he's caught the killer." "Aye," Hamish sighed, scratching his head. "The inspector does love a parade, but I'm no interested in the parade, Mrs. Hildred. I'm just interested in Archie MacLean getting home to his supper. And for that to happen, I think we need to set a little trap, one that even a man as busy as DCI Blair can't ignore." He turned toward the door, whistling for Towser. He had the motive, a petty, vengeful woman pushed to the brink by an even more vengeful widow. Now, he just had to make the killer prove it to the one man who refused to see the truth. The night had descended on Lochdubh with the finality of a heavy iron lid. The hair had thickened into a soup so dense that the street lamps were merely ghostly, amber smudges in the gloom. It was the perfect weather for a predator, or for a policeman who knew that the best way to catch a thief was to let them believe they were the smartest person in the room. Hamish Macbeth returned to the Tommel Castle Hotel, not through the front door this time, but by way of the staff entrance. He found Mr. Johnson, the manager, in the small, cramped office behind the reception desk. "Hamish," Johnson said, looking up from his ledgers, "I thought you'd be at the station, celebrating Blair's great victory." "The man has been on the telephone to the newspapers for the last hour. The inspector is a man of great enthusiasm," Hamish said, leaning against the doorframe and looking particularly vacant. "But he's a wee bit worried about the Reigate letters. You wouldn't happen to know anything about them, would you?" Johnson frowned. "Reigate? No. Why?" "Well," Hamish said, scratching his ear, "it seems Mrs. Pemberton told the minister's wife she'd hidden a waterproof pouch near the bridge. Something about legal papers and a fraudulent relative. I told the inspector and he sent for a special diving team from Aberdeen. They'll be here at first light to dredge the deep pool under the central arch. Blair says if those letters are there, they'll prove Archie had an accomplice." Hamish knew that Mrs. Hildred was likely listening. The walls of the Tommel Castle Hotel were thick, but the ventilation shafts in the old stone building acted like a series of copper trumpets for those with an ear to the floorboards. "Diving team? At first light?" Johnson shook his head. "In this weather, they'll be lucky to find the river, let alone a pouch." "Aye," Hamish sighed. "It's a pity I have to stay there all night to guard the spot. My back is fair killing me, and Towser hates the damp. I was thinking of just leaving my hat on the stone wall and nipping back here for a dram, but Blair would have my hide if he found out." He wandered back out into the lobby, where Mrs. Hildred was standing by the fireplace, her coat on and her suitcase at her feet. She looked pale, her eyes darting toward the door every time the wind rattled the glass. "Leaving us so soon, ma'am?" Hamish asked, his voice dripping with syrupy concern. "The train," she snapped, not looking at him. "I told you, my nerves cannot stand this place. It's a shame," Hamish said. "The Aberdeen divers are grand conversationalists, and they're sure to find that waterproof bag. It's caught right on the jagged rock under the bridge, the one Archie couldn't reach. If the letters are as damning as the minister's wife says, there'll be a lot of folk in the south looking for a good lawyer tomorrow." He tipped his cap to her, his expression one of gormless sincerity. "Safe travels to you, Mrs. Hildred. I'd best get down to the river. It's going to be a long cold night of guarding a bag I cannot even see in the dark." Hamish stepped out into the night, but he didn't go to the bridge, at least not directly. He circled back to the police station, where he found a dusty, discarded police mannequin that had been used for a road safety campaign in the 80s. He dressed it in his spare greatcoat and a peaked cap, then carried it down to the riverbank. In the shadows of the old stone bridge, he propped the mannequin against the low wall facing the water. From a distance, in the swirling mist, it looked exactly like Constable Macbeth stoically performing his duty. Hamish then retreated into the hollowed-out trunk of an ancient gnarled oak tree 30 yards away. He sat on his haunches, Towser huddled between his knees, and pulled a thermos of tea from his pocket. "Now we wait, Towser," he whispered. "We wait for the cat to come for the cream." An hour passed. The only sound was the relentless roar of the River Deux and the occasional splash of a leaping salmon. Then the silence of the woods was broken by the soft, rhythmic crunch of gravel. A figure emerged from the mist. It wasn't the niece. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark leather jacket. He was carrying a long-handled gaff, the kind used by poachers to pull fish from the deep pools. Behind him, moving with the silent agility PK had described, was Mrs. Hildred. They stopped 10 yards from the bridge, staring at the silhouette of the constable leaning against the wall. "He's asleep," the man hissed, his voice carrying on the wind. "Look at him. The lazy sod hasn't moved an inch in 20 minutes. "Just get the bag, Marcus," Mrs. Hildred whispered, her voice tight with panic. "If those letters get to the Aberdeen team, we're finished." Agatha was specific in her diary. She had everything, the bank records, the Surrey affidavits. Get them and get to the car. The man moved toward the riverbank, the gaff held ready. He began to scramble down the slippery rocks toward the churning water, his eyes fixed on the spot Hamish had accidentally mentioned. Hamish took a slow sip of his tea. The trap was sprung. He hadn't just spread a rumour. He had offered them the one thing a murderer cannot resist, the chance to bury the past one last time. "You know, Towser," Hamish murmured, standing up and stretching his long limbs. "It's a terrible thing to underestimate a Highlander. They think because we move slow, we think slow." He stepped out from behind the tree, his heavy torch flicking on, the beam cutting through the hair like a sword of white light. "Good evening to you both," Hamish said, his voice no longer lazy, but as cold and sharp as a winter frost. "I hope you've brought your swimming trunks. The water is a bit brisk this time of year." The beam of Hamish's torch was a solid pillar of light in the shifting grey of the Har. It caught Marcus in a grotesque pose, half crouched on a moss-covered rock, the long-handled gaff extended over the water like a skeletal finger. Mrs. Hildred stood frozen on the path above him, her face drained of all its London sophistication, looking like a cornered stoat. "There is no bag, Marcus," Hamish said, his voice carrying clearly over the roar of the River Dubh. "There never was. I'm afraid I told a wee bit of a lie. It's a terrible habit I have when I'm bored." Marcus blinked into the light, his eyes squinting. He looked toward the constable, still leaning against the bridge wall. The mannequin's head had tilted slightly in the wind, giving it a jaunty, drunken appearance. You set us up," Marcus growled. His voice was thick, the sound of a man who used his fists more often than his brain. He began to scramble back up the bank, his boots slipping on the wet peat. "It's a sting operation," Hamish explained helpfully. "I saw it on the television once, though usually there's more than one policeman and a dog that doesn't have a flatulence problem." "Get him, Marcus!" Mrs. Hildred screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill hysterical pitch. "He's alone! There's no one for miles." Marcus didn't need the encouragement. He was a large man, built like a Highland bull, and he was cornered. He lunged at Hamish, swinging the heavy metal gaff like a scythe. Hamish moved. In the village he was known for a gait that suggested his joints were made of loosely tied string, but in the face of violence, that gangling frame became a blur of deceptive speed. He stepped inside the arc of the swing, the metal hook whistling inches past his ear, and planted a large, muddy boot firmly on Marcus's shin. As Marcus buckled with a roar of pain, Hamish didn't use a flashy martial arts move. He simply grabbed the front of the man's leather jacket and used Marcus's own momentum to guide him toward a particularly deep patch of boggy peat. With a sound like a giant boot being pulled out of the mud, a wet, sucking thwack, Marcus went down face first. "Stay there now," Hamish cautioned, "or the suction will have your trousers off, and nobody wants to see that in this light." Behind him he heard the frantic scrabble of heels on the road. Mrs. Hildred was bolting toward the dark silhouette of the Mercedes parked further up the track. "Towser, heel!" Hamish shouted. The dog, usually interested only in sleep and the contents of other people's pockets, suddenly remembered his ancestry as a working animal. He didn't bite. Hamish hadn't trained him for that. But he did what he did best. He got underfoot. He streaked ahead of the running woman and executed a perfect lazy dog maneuver, flopping directly in her path to investigate a fascinating scent. Mrs. Hildred tripped over the woolly obstacle, letting out a sharp oof as she tumbled into the roadside ditch. Hamish ambled over, his torchlight dancing on the heather. He reached down and plucked a small, heavy object from the mud where she had fallen. It was a pair of sturdy, leather-soled shoes, wrapped in a plastic bag. Even in the gloom, the red clay caked into the treads was unmistakable. The accomplice boots, Hamish noted. You were going to toss them in the loch on your way out of town, I expect. A tidy woman, Mrs. Hildred. My mother would have liked your attention to detail. He reached into his greatcoat and produced a pair of heavy iron handcuffs. Mrs. Hildred scrambled up, her expensive coat ruined, her hair a wild, sodden mess. She looked at Hamish with a hatred so pure it seemed to vibrate. You're nothing, she spat. A backwater nothing in a ridiculous hat. You think this matters? My lawyers will have this thrown out before we reach the city. You have no witnesses. It's your word against ours. Aye, Hamish said, clicking the first cuff onto her wrist with a practiced snap. But then there's the silent witness. You see, when you were struggling, the widow on the bridge, the silver tip of her stick didn't just wedge into the stone. It caught a thread of that very fine silk scarf you were wearing. I found it tucked into the masonry this afternoon. The lab in Strathbane is very good with silk. They say it's quite a rare pattern. It was another lie. He'd found a piece of blue lint that might have come from a dishcloth, but Mrs. Hildred didn't know that. Her eyes went wide, her confidence finally shattering. She wouldn't die, the woman suddenly wailed, the confession spilling out in a rush of panicked resentment. She just kept talking, telling me how she'd have me jailed. I only meant to quiet her. The stick was right there. They always say that, Hamish murmured, pulling her toward the bog where Marcus was still struggling to extricate his face from the peat. They only ever mean to quiet people, but they always end up making a terrible amount of noise. The arrest was, as Hamish had predicted, messy. He had to haul Marcus out of the mud, which resulted in Hamish's own uniform being coated in a layer of stinking slime. He then had to march the pair of them, handcuffed together, bickering violently, back toward the village. As they reached the edge of Lochdubh, the lights of the police cars from Strathbane began to flicker in the distance. DCI Blair was returning, no doubt to check on his mannequin or to gloat further. Hamish stopped, looking at his muddy sleeves and his exhausted dog. He looked at the two killers, who were now sobbing with cold and fury. Now, Hamish said to himself, a slow, cunning smile spreading across his face. How do I make sure I don't get a medal for this? I really cannot afford the commute to Glasgow. The blue and red lights of the Strathbane police cruisers cut through the hair like a garish disco in a graveyard. As the cars skidded to a halt near the old bridge, DCI Blair tumbled out of the lead vehicle, his face already contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He had spent the last hour at the hotel bar, only to be told by a smirking waiter that his constable was currently engaging in a high-speed foot chase through the peat bogs. "Macbeth!" Blair screamed, his voice cracking with the strain. "What in the name of all that is holy is going on here? Why are these people in cuffs? And why do you look like you've been swimming in a whiskey distillery's waste pipe?" Hamish, who was currently leaning against a tree, while Marcus and Mrs. Hildred sat shivering on the ground, adopted a look of such profound, wide-eyed bewilderment that he appeared almost lobotomized. He let his jaw drop and scratched his head with a muddy hand. "Ah, Inspector! Thank goodness you're here!" Hamish cried, his voice pitching into a high, grateful whine. "It's just as you said, sir. Your brilliant strategy worked a charm." Blair stopped mid-stride, his chest puffed out like a disgruntled pigeon. My strategy?" "Aye," Hamish nodded vigorously. "When you told me earlier, you remember, sir? Down by the river, that the red clay on that mallet was a deliberate plant. designed to lead us toward the visitor center so we'd catch the real killers trying to skip town. Well, I thought you were just being modest. But then I saw them, exactly where you predicted they'd be, trying to hide these red clay boots. He kicked the plastic bag containing the evidence toward Blair's feet. Blair stared at the boots. He looked at the suspects. He looked at the detectives, Macnab and Anderson, who were climbing out of the car behind him. Blair's mind, usually a slow-moving gear of resentment and self-interest, began to spin. He didn't remember saying anything about a deliberate plant, but the idea that he had masterminded a complex double bluff was far too tempting to ignore. "Of course," Blair said, his voice dropping an octave as he smoothed his tie. "The red clay. I knew the moment I saw it. It was too obvious, Macbeth. A child could see it was a frame-up. I merely allowed you to play the part of the bumbling local, to put them off their guard while I coordinated the psychological pressure from the rear." "It was a masterstroke, sir," Hamish breathed, looking at the other detectives with an expression of awe. "The way you used Archie McLean as a stalking horse to make the killers think they were safe. I never would have thought of it. They were so confident they even started confessing right there in the mud. Mrs. Hildred here was just saying how she couldn't believe a city detective of your caliber would see through her silk scarf tricks so fast." Mrs. Hildred opened her mouth to scream a protest, but Hamish stepped subtly on her toe. "The silk scarf," Blair bellowed, seizing on the phantom clue. "Precisely. A classic oversight on her part. I noted it immediately. Macnab, get these two into the back of the van, and be careful with those boots. They're the cornerstone of my forensic reconstruction." "And the promotion, sir?" Hamish asked, his voice dripping with faux anxiety. "The chief constable is going to be so impressed. They'll be wanting you for that assistant commissioner opening in London, I'm sure. Or at least a move to the big city headquarters." Blair's eyes gleamed with the prospect of a shiny new office and a commute that didn't involve sheep. He looked at Hamish. Muddy, lanky, and apparently thick as a plank, and felt a rare surge of generosity. "You did all right, Macbeth," Blair grunted. "In a supporting role, I'll make sure the report mentions you followed my orders to the letter. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. A man of my talents is needed where the real crime is, not in this damp puddle of a village." "Aye, sir," Hamish said, looking downcast. "It's a pity. I was hoping I might get a wee commendation myself. Maybe a transfer to Strathbane? I've always wanted to work in a proper station with a vending machine." Blair let out a sharp, barking laugh. "You? In Strathbane? Don't be ridiculous, Macbeth. You'd be lost without a map and a guide dog. No, you stay here in Lochdubh. It's exactly where you belong. Someone has to keep the sheep in line while I'm handling the high-profile cases." Hamish sighed, a sound of heavy, simulated disappointment. "If you say so, Inspector, I suppose I'll just have to stay here and rot." As the police van pulled away, taking the killers and the glory-bound DCI Blair with it, Hamish stood in the middle of the road. The silence of the Highlands began to knit itself back together. The Har was lifting, revealing a sliver of a silver moon reflecting off the still waters of the loch. "Well, Towser," Hamish said, his voice returning to its normal dry tone. "That's that. We've saved the village, freed Archie, and most importantly, we've ensured that the only person who wants me promoted thinks I'm an idiot." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slightly squashed fly cemetery pastry he'd liberated from the post office earlier. He broke off a piece for the dog. "It's a heavy price to pay, being a genius," Hamish whispered, "but at least the commute is short." The morning after the arrest, Lochdubh was reborn. The spiteful rain and the suffocating Har had vanished, replaced by a sky of such brilliant, piercing blue that the mountains looked as though they had been cut out of paper and pasted against the horizon. The air was crisp, tasting of salt and pine, with just enough of a breeze to keep the midges at bay. Hamish Macbeth was exactly where he belonged, on the small stone pier, sitting on an overturned lobster creel. He was dressed in his oldest, most comfortable tweed jacket, the one with the leather patches on the elbows that had long since lost their structural integrity. Between his knees, a battered tin pot of tea was steaming, and in his hand was a thick sandwich filled with Archie McLean's thank-you gift, home-cured venison. "It's a grand day, Hamish," a voice called out. Hamish looked up to see Archie himself, looking 10 years younger now that he wasn't behind bars or being shouted at by a widow. He was carrying a fresh salmon, its scales shimmering like silver coins. "It is that, Archie," Hamish agreed, "and I see the fishing is improving." Archie winked, a slow, deliberate movement of a weathered eyelid. "The river was high, Hamish. The fish were just jumping into my arms. It would have been rude to refuse them." "I've left one on your doorstep. A consultation fee, you might call it. I'll call it evidence, and I'll see that it's properly disposed of in a frying pan," Hamish said with a grin. Archie nodded, satisfied, and wandered off toward the village, whistling a tune that sounded suspiciously like a Highland victory march. The village was buzzing. The morning papers in Strathbane were already carrying the headline, "Blair strikes again, mastermind detective unmasks companion killer." There was a large photograph of Blair looking sternly at a piece of evidence, his chest expanded to near bursting point. There was no mention of a local constable, other than a brief note at the end about routine assistance provided by the Lochdubh station. Hamish took a long, satisfying sip of tea. To anyone else, the lack of credit would have been an insult. To Hamish, it was a shield. As long as the brass in Strathbane thought he was a lucky incompetent, they would leave him to his mountains, his dog, and his illicitly obtained dinners. A shadow fell over him, and the scent of expensive French perfume cut through the smell of the harbour. "I see the useless peasant has returned to his natural habitat," Priscilla Halberton Smythe said, leaning against the pier railing beside him. She was dressed for riding, her blonde hair caught in a neat chignon. "It's a quiet life, Priscilla," Hamish said, not looking up but feeling the familiar, pleasant ache in his chest. "Somebody has to do it." "My father is quite impressed with DCI Blair," she remarked, her voice dry. "He thinks the man is a genius for spotting the red clay discrepancy. He's even invited him to the castle for a celebratory dinner next week." Hamish chuckled. "I hope the Colonel has plenty of whiskey. Blair is a man of great thirst." Priscilla looked out over the loch, her expression softening. "He didn't do it, Hamish. We both know that. I saw you in the library. You had that look, the one you get when you're 3 steps ahead of everyone else and pretending you can't find your own feet." Hamish finally looked at her, his hazel eyes clear and intelligent for a brief, unguarded second. "The truth is a heavy thing to carry, Priscilla. Better to let a man like Blair haul it around. He's got the ego for the weight. And what will you do now, Hamish Macbeth?" "Well," Hamish said, standing up and stretching his long limbs until his joints popped. "I have a very important appointment. Mrs. Christie at the post office says she's got a new shipment of dark roast coffee, and I believe I owe Towser a long walk up the glen to see if the eagles are nesting." Priscilla smiled, a real smile this time, and reached out, patting his arm. "You're a very strange man, Hamish, but I suppose Lochdubh would be a much poorer place without its laziest policeman." She turned and walked back toward the hotel, her boots clicking rhythmically on the stone. Hamish watched her go until she was just a small figure against the backdrop of the grey turrets. "Come on, Towser," he said, whistling for the dog. They walked back through the village, past the quiet houses where curtains twitched and neighbours shared the latest revised version of the bridge murder. By the time they reached the police station, the story would have changed 3 more times, likely involving ghosts, international spies, and a secret tunnel under the river. Hamish didn't mind. He stepped into his kitchen, the familiar scent of peat smoke and old floor wax welcoming him home. He put the kettle on the Rayburn, threw a log onto the fire, and sat down in his armchair. Through the window, he could see the River Dew sparkling in the sun. The widow was gone, the niece was in a cell, and the peace, the beautiful, deceptive, gossipy peace of the Highlands, had returned. Hamish closed his eyes, a small smile playing on his lips. He was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly what he wanted to do. And as long as he kept looking stupid, he could stay there forever. The week following the bridge murder saw Lochdubh return to its usual state of simmering discontent and high-velocity gossip. However, the village's collective focus had shifted from the tragic end of Mrs. Agatha Pemberton to the startling irony of her final testament. As Priscilla had predicted, the widow had indeed struck her relatives and her murderous companion entirely out of her will. The new master of Craigie House was not a person at all, but the Agatha Pemberton Sanctuary for Distressed Felines. Hamish Macbeth stood at the harbour, watching a large, brightly painted van struggle to navigate the narrow, winding road that led up the hill. The side of the van featured a cartoon cat wearing a crown, looking remarkably as smug as the late Mrs. Pemberton herself. "God preserve us, Hamish," muttered Lakey McLean, the local schoolteacher, as he joined the constable at the water's edge. "They say there are 30 of them in that first load. 30. The village will be knee-deep in ginger toms and calicos before the month is out." Hamish leaned back against a piling, puffing contentedly on his pipe. "Aye, Lakey, it's a feline invasion. I hear the head of the sanctuary is a woman from Brighton who believes that cats are the reincarnated souls of Egyptian royalty. She's already asked me if I can arrest any seagulls that look at the cats disrespectfully." Lackey groaned. "First the Sassenach widow, now a colony of pampered mouses and a priestess of Isis. Does the madness never end?" "Not in the Highlands, Lakey," Hamish said with a small secret smile. "Not in the Highlands." Hamish eventually wandered away from the harbour, Towser trotting at his heels with an air of renewed purpose. The dog had already discovered that the sanctuary staff were soft-hearted Londoners who viewed a starving Highland mongrel as a tragic figure. Towser had already secured 3 premium tins of tuna in the last 48 hours, and his midsection was beginning to reflect his success. As they passed the bridge, the scene of the crime now scrubbed clean by the relentless Highland weather, Hamish paused. He looked down at the swirling dark water of the River Dew. A small white object was snagged in the reeds. He climbed down the bank, his long legs moving with careful precision, and plucked it from the mud. It was a small plastic laminated card, the Agatha Pemberton Sanctuary, membership ID first. He turned it over in his hands. He thought of the widow's vanity, her loneliness, and the bitter, sharp-edged fear that had driven Mrs. Hildred to strike her down. In the end, all that remained of the woman's grand, litigious life was a busload of cats and a piece of plastic in the mud. "Human nature, Towser," Hamish whispered, "is a far more dangerous thing than the river." He tucked the card into his pocket, evidence of nothing but his own thoughts, and climbed back to the road. Near the gates of Craigie House, he encountered Priscilla Halberton Smythe once more. She was watching a group of workers install a high, cat-proof fence around the perimeter of the estate. "The Colonel is in a towering rage, Hamish," she said, though her eyes were dancing with amusement. "He says the scent of 30 cats on the wind is going to ruin his grouse moor. He's already drafting a letter to the Times. It'll give the Colonel something to do," Hamish noted. "Keeps him from worrying about the roof restoration." Priscilla stepped closer, her tone becoming serious. "I spoke to my cousin in London. The police there have reopened the Abernathy case. It seems Mrs. Hildred and her Marcus have a history of companionship that ends in probate court. Your silk scarf bluff was the thread that pulled the whole thing apart. Blair is being hailed as the Sherlock of the North in the metropolitan tabloids. Good for the inspector," Hamish said, his voice flat. "I hope he enjoys the limelight. It can be a very hot and thirsty place. You don't regret it? The credit? The promotion? Hamish looked up at the mountains, where a golden eagle was circling in the thermals, a solitary and beautiful speck against the blue. Look at that bird, Priscilla. Do you think he'd be happier if he were promoted to a gilded cage in a London zoo? He'd have a regular supply of meat and a shiny plaque with his name on it. But he wouldn't be the master of the glen, would he? Priscilla sighed, a sound of soft resignation. No, Hamish, I suppose he wouldn't. You're a very frustrating man, but you're a very honest one. She turned and began her walk back toward the hotel. Hamish watched her for a moment, then turned his gaze back to his own small station. The blue police lamp over the door was off, and the chimney was sending a thin, inviting curl of smoke into the clear air. He had a fresh salmon in his kitchen, a loyal dog at his side, and the entire village of Lochdubh convinced he was a lazy, red-haired non-entity. He had escaped the trap of the city, the trap of the promotion, and the trap of the widow's resentment. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, purple shadows over the loch, Police Constable Hamish Macbeth whistled for Towser and began the short walk home. He had no paperwork to finish, no superiors to satisfy, and a pot of stew that needed his undivided attention. In the Highlands, the murders were frequent, the weather was temperamental, and the gossip was eternal. But for now, the air was still, and Hamish Macbeth was exactly where he was meant to be,